Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is talking again about the poles. We're going to be looking at the epic of polar history in general and humanity's records in whole. All of humanity's records of polar exploration and navigation. You know, the mainstream media makes it out as though these things, these places have been fully charted and mapped and completely recorded in every minute detail. That polar exploration was done hundreds of years ago, and that there's nothing to see there anymore. There's no purpose in going there. I think anybody who understands about the flat Earth knows that there's much more to the poles than that. And so we're going to have a much more in-depth look into the poles. So we're going to begin here with polar exploration and the race for the North Pole. Roll 'em.
It was a race that had few rules. Its competitors, fewer scruples. Some men would lie, cheat, and steal to win. Others would sacrifice their own lives and those of their companions. For what? To be the first to plant a flag on two empty stretches of ice. This is the story of the race for the North and South Poles.
And so we already have them admitting to murder to reach the poles and all types of skullduggery.
There remain few unexplored realms on Earth. Among them were two imaginary points surrounded by hundreds of miles of ice and snow. The North and South
Fake
Poles.
CGI.
It's an imaginary spot, but there was a spot to be reached. And once you reached it, then nobody else
It's
could
an
reach
imaginary
it first.
spot.
And
Wait,
South
wait, wait,
Poles.
wait.
It's an
that
imaginary
one again.
spot, but there was a spot to be reached. And once you reached it, then nobody else could reach
It's
it
an
first.
imaginary spot. It's not imaginary at all. It's the center of the Earth, the North Pole, and the South Pole is the gigantic perpendicular ice barrier that holds in the oceans.
These frozen
All right.
realms summoned a select group of men, determined to test themselves against nature.
Oh,
seeking
that's
a
why they went, right?
chance At immortality. Their names resounded in the press like modern-day rock stars. Peary, Cook, Scott, Amundsen.
Look at the ice wall.
In order to survive, they had to fight not only the elements, but their own inner demons. In order to win, they had to risk their very lives. April.
But again, I'm going to pause it here. Again, they show flat water. They show a flat horizon, no mountains and water. So if we back it up here and look again at what they show us at this wall here, this is obviously the South Pole. But they use this image when they're talking about the North Pole. Okay, so they're giving us the idea that the North Pole is flat and up on some sort of a plateau, or that it's flat and that there's no mountains there. There's just nothing to see there. They also, you'll see this repeatedly as we carry on, they constantly make it out as though the North Pole is so inhospitable that humans can't survive there and that you'll be killed if you try to go there. Don't possibly try to go there because you'll be killed. This is what they ingrain to us with these shows. You'll see this as we carry on.
First, 1909. Commander Robert E. Peary and his support teams picked their way through shifting ice in his latest effort to reach the North Pole. Each night they dined on the same meal of pemmican, a concoction of dried meat, fat, and raisins. Each morning, they
Oh,
struck
so
camp
harsh.
and labored 10 hours to cover 10 miles. Through all of this,
Don't go
the
there.
same fear tormented the famous explorer. Peary knew that at the age of 52, this was certainly his last chance to realize his quest. Time was not the only enemy. Peary's polar rival, Dr. Frederick Cook, had quietly sent word to his supporters that he would attempt to reach the North Pole first. Peary seethed. He hadn't expected a race for the pole. He believed it was his prize, and conquering it, his destiny.
Peary had no use for anybody who he saw as a rival, and they were all rivals if they were seeking the North Pole or anything like it.
Okay, so I'm pausing here again. We've just heard a little bit about Peary. So now that we know about the pole, and we've seen some of the other documentaries that I've shown you guys about the history of the pole, and what you'll notice is that all of these explorers are funded completely by the Royal Society, and also the National Geographic Society, which is really just another extension of the Royal Society. And isn't it amazing how National Geographic has made itself into such a staple of science and of wholesome family science in North America, when really it's just a magazine pushed down from the Royal Society, and it pushes evolution and the heliocentric model in every possible way. So what they're talking about here is the fight, the feud between these different explorers. But in reality, we know that they were all working for the society. So, but they openly admit to being murderers and underhanded, using underhanded tactics right away. But so we'll get to some more points here. The other thing is that they make it out as though you can't go there, it's impossible, you'll die, as though no human habitation is possible. But we know the Eskimos are up there continually and live there and have lived there for thousands of years. All right, let's carry on.
Edwin Peary took his first breath on May 6, 1856, in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. His father died when he was barely 3 years old, leaving the boy nicknamed Bertie in the care of his doting mother.
She had raised him in a very girlish fashion for the first 6 or 7 years of his life, and he would often come home with his clothing torn, having been in fights, because he'd had to assert himself in order to prove that he was really a little boy and not a little girl.
Like most boys of the time, Peary enjoyed reading stories of Arctic adventures and polar bear hunts. He finally saw the Arctic with his own eyes while visiting southern Greenland in 1886. It was here, while on leave from his job as a civil engineer with the U.S. Navy, that the 30-year-old lieutenant began to design his own destiny. The North Pole.
Wait. So he already has his commission at 30 years, but he's a poor little boy?
Since the dawn of civilization, it was a mystery that had intrigued all manner of men. Vikings were the first to venture into the forbidding north, but an impenetrable pack of ice pushed them back. Generation upon generation of adventurers followed in their wake.
More
with
CGI
little
BS.
success. By
This is interesting.
1882,
Look at this ring
the
around
farthest
the
north
pole.
reached by man was still 400 miles shy of the pole. Now, Robert Peary dreamt of adding his name to the
See, he's
roster of Arctic
more worried
heroes.
about sewing cool little
As he laid
pockets
the plans
into
for
his
this latest
pants.
adventure, Peary was about to meet another American who would play a leading role in this polar contest. Dr. Frederick Cook.
Dr. Cook was a man unknown. People were very divided about who he was. His enemies said he was nothing but a cheap fake. And his friends said that he had never had a bad day in his life until he got mixed up with Robert E. Peary.
Frederick Albert Cook was never a stranger to adversity. By age 23, this resourceful son of German immigrants had worked his way through medical school by selling milk. That same year, he lost his wife and newborn baby due to complications from childbirth. The grieving doctor filled his days reading Arctic explorations by the famous American explorer Elisha Kent Kane.
He had a devouring ambition to go there. And he read an advertisement in a newspaper in New York that had been placed there by Peary asking for a surgeon for his first North Greenland expedition. Aha! This is what he wanted.
Cook and Peary met for the first time in Philadelphia in the spring of 1891. The doctor impressed Peary as the kind of man he sought for his mission.
Peary didn't really want any rivals on this expedition, so he looked for people who were enthusiasts but amateurs. He had an interview with Dr. Cook and accepted him that day to be the expedition's physician.
The stage was set. In the coming years, Cook and Peary's ambitions would clash in a bitter race for the North Pole. By the age of 30, Lieutenant Robert E. Peary had chosen this hostile realm of ice and snow as his sure road to fame and fortune. In July of 1891, the civil engineer obtained a 2-year leave from the Navy and headed north as leader of an exploratory expedition. As his ship Kite encountered sea ice, Peary was finally entering the Arctic of his boyhood dreams. After 4 weeks sailing, Peary and his 6-member team disembarked to a rocky shore in northern Greenland. The area was inhabited solely by native Inuit. The expedition was already making headlines back home. Josephine, Peary's wife of 2 years, had accompanied him north, causing a newspaper sensation.
The press was divided between extolling her for being so brave and loyal to her husband and excoriating Peary for even suggesting taking her along to what they called the icy Sahara. That was no place for a woman, according to the 19th century.
Josephine shared a wood cabin measuring only 22 by 12 feet with the 6 male members of the expedition. This would be their living quarters for a year. Peary and Cook worked well together in the crisp chill of northern Greenland. Cook let his hair grow long and wore furs loosely in the Inuit fashion, which kept an insulating layer of warm air near the skin. In May of the following year, Peary set out northward over the ice cap. Here, his journey to the pole truly began.
When you're on that glacier, you can literally only see 3 things, and that is an infinite amount of ice, an infinite amount of sky, and sunshine. That's it. There's nothing else to be seen. I think he was fascinated by that.
Peary traveled 500 miles before dwindling supplies forced him to turn back. He had made no real inroads to the pole. Still, he did claim at least one important discovery. He charted a channel of water previously undiscovered. Peary speculated that it formed the northern boundary of Greenland.
Peary Channel, it was on the maps for some time till people got there and found there was no channel. He had either seen something or thought he saw something, or he had invented something. My feeling is that his ambition was such that, you see, he had to bring back something. For every trip he made, he had to bring back a triumph so that he could get money for the next trip.
Peary returned to the States and launched a lucrative lecture tour. As his fame grew, he began planning a second expedition that would head even farther north. At the same time, his colleague, Dr. Frederick Cook, requested permission to publish his own studies of the Inuit. Peary refused, preferring to keep the limelight focused on himself. Dr. Cook promptly resigned. The foundation of their polar rivalry was beginning to take shape. September 13th, 1893. Lieutenant Peary's second expedition started on a high note. A pregnant Josephine had once again accompanied her husband to Greenland. With the onset of the sunless winter, she gave birth to their first child, Marie Anagito Peary. Peary's joy at fatherhood couldn't compensate for the fact that he made no progress toward the pole. When he once again set out over the ice cap, bad weather destroyed vital food supplies. Peary now faced a polar explorer's most dangerous hazard: starvation. A herd of unlucky musk oxen saved the day. Despite these difficulties, the explorer artfully salvaged his reputation by transporting 2 huge meteorites to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Okay, so again, you can see that it's not that difficult to survive there, and they're making it out as though it's just brutal conditions. They make it out as though they would have died. And yet, oh, magically, there's a huge herd of muskox. The Inuit and the people there know the timings of the trails and of the timings of the movement of different game and where they'll be. It's not impossible to live there. It's a land of plenty and bounty. But they make it out that you can't go there because you'll die. There's a book by Farley Mowat, a famous Canadian author, who, in this book called People of the Deer, he talks about that the land on certain times of the year, if you were to fly over in a helicopter, you wouldn't know if you were moving or the helicopter was, because the land seemed to be moving. It's funny that I'm talking about this, but the land seemed to be moving, but it was because there was so many caribou on the run during their migration period. There's millions and millions of caribou on the run, and they literally flood the land, and people have to be careful that they're not caught up in the stampede of them to be trampled by them. It's a huge movement. Anyways, so that's just one example of a migratory herd in the north. And flat earthers know this, that the birds actually go north in the winter because it becomes a land of plenty. It actually is a better place for them to eat. It's a good environment for them to stay in. So there's obviously huge open areas that have tons of vegetation for them to feed on. Okay, so we'll carry on.
The Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen had designed a unique ice ship, the Fram, and in 1893, he sailed her high into the Arctic ice pack. Nansen then set out on skis toward the pole, setting a record farthest north before turning back. The guy that made this and posted it originally, I guess, cut it off here. There's quite a few. Every time he comes back from a commercial break, he cuts it a little bit. We'll carry on. The North Pole, Robert E. Peary's desire had become an obsession.
Now, had he failed, or had they been there and they knew it was there all along and they kept going back, but they kept saying that they didn't make it? And why was he so obsessed with it? What was up there that was so amazing that they're obsessed with it?
Even the furnishings of his Washington, D.C. apartment reflected the powerful grip the Arctic held on his life. In the summer of 1898,
they know
the
truth. These are the Royal Society.
And headed north once
These guys know now at this time that the Earth is flat. They have these records, and they're going to the pole repeatedly to check it out.
A Norwegian expedition was also exploring the same part of the Arctic. Peary was certain they were intent on beating him to the pole. Gripped by paranoia, the lieutenant started for his northern headquarters during the dark winter, when temperatures were dangerously low. Even Peary's longtime assistant, Matthew Henson, struggled in the extreme cold. Peary had first hired Henson 12 years earlier as his manservant during surveying work in Nicaragua. Henson soon became the lieutenant's right-hand man.
Henson proved to be so reliable, so durable, and so dependable that Peary never again left the shores of the United States on expeditionary work without Henson as one of his companions.
After 17 days of sledging, the men arrived at a vacant hut that had been used by explorers in decades past. Once inside, Peary complained of a wooden feeling in his feet. Henson removed Peary's boots to discover that his toes were black. They were completely frozen. The condition was so severe, the expedition doctor amputated most of them within the week. Peary remained in the Arctic for 4 years, but his injuries prevented any serious attempt on the pole. Undaunted, the commander retreated to his property on Eagle Island, Maine, to formulate his next plan of attack.
Peary had failed in 3 major expeditions to reach the pole. He felt that one of the reasons was because he started from not the shores of the Arctic Ocean where the ice was ready for him, but from 300 to 400 miles south of that point, which is as far as any ships could penetrate to get him there.
Like Nansen before him, Peary decided he would build a special ship that could take him directly to the shores of the Arctic Ocean. But he would be forced to bide his time during its construction, leaving the pole vulnerable to other contenders. By 1897, Peary's one-time colleague, Dr. Frederick Cook, had returned to his medical practice. Business was thriving. Still, he wanted desperately to return to polar exploration. One afternoon,
So he's doing well for himself. He makes good money, but he's obsessed with the pole.
The Belgian Antarctic expedition. 5 months later, Cook was on board the Belgica.
Oh, now he's gone south.
Covered outer islands of the southern
We all know Cook.
continent, Antarctica.
The expedition went so far south that when the winter closed in, they were unable to return because they were frozen in the ice.
But it's
So
not the way that
Belgians
they make it out.
became
See the way they look
first
ancient?
expedition to winter in the Antarctic.
Watch later.
Cook welcomed the opportunity
This is
to
not
closely examine
ancient
this
times.
new landscape and made several sledge journeys across the virgin snow. He shared his sense of wonder with Belgica's second mate, a young Norwegian who would one day figure dramatically
You'll see what I mean shortly.
in the race for the southern pole. His name was Roald Amundsen.
Amundsen was a shy guy, a kind of a dreamer, a little boy who wanted to be a great man someday.
Since his boyhood,
See, it's
Amundsen
silly
had
boyhood
dreamed of following
silliness
in the
to want to
footsteps
go
of
to the
famed
North
explorer
Pole.
Fridtjof Nansen.
It's the only reason.
Amundsen's internship
Anybody would
aboard
wanna go there.
Belgica figured as part of that plan. He
So they're
recognized
silly
early
boys,
on that he had
but they're the
much to
best
learn
minds.
from Dr. Cook's experiences.
And explorers.
Amundsen knew the snow from Norway, but he didn't really knew the ice. Dr. Cook learned a lot about that, and also the Eskimos. They discussed the clothes, the food, how to get warm, how to sleep, all these
That's all they talked about.
classical themes of the polar expeditions.
Spring arrived, but the ice near the ship remained frozen. Belgica's crew grew desperate. Cook convinced the men to take up picks and axes and dig a channel through the floe to a distant pool of water.
Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of
2
this could
months
be
later,
true. A lot of this is
a
true.
gate opened,
I'm sure.
allowing the ship to escape.
No body of men were ever happier than the officers and crew of the Belgica as the good old ship thumped the edges of the ice, which had held her a prisoner for nearly a year.
Cook had returned from Antarctica, a bona fide explorer. His hunger for celebrity now rivaled that of his old friend Robert Peary, who
Peary was
once
trying
again
for the pole.
preparing to try for the pole. In March of 1905, Commander Peary christened his sturdy new ice ship Roosevelt in honor of the popular American president. Captained by Newfoundlander Bob Bartlett, the Roosevelt successfully battled sea ice, carrying Peary to the edge of the Arctic Ocean by September 1906.
So 06, he's there again.
By beginning his polar assault from here, Peary would eliminate hundreds of miles of needless travel over land. The following spring, the 49-year-old Peary prepared for what he considered to be his best opportunity to realize his dream.
He felt that his equipment was in the right order. He was also employing the Eskimos as his drivers as well as his helpers, so he felt that he had all the expertise in the right place at the right time to do what he wanted to do.
This time we shall win. God and all good angels grant it, and let me seize this great trophy for the flag.
To succeed, Peary would have to travel over 800 miles while transporting literally tons of supplies. He would have to return before the ice pack began to thaw, which would cut him off from land. February 28, 1906. Matthew Henson led the way as sledge teams forged a trail through the maze of water and ice. They chopped through massive pressure ridges. They crossed open leads of water on a raft of pancake ice.
It was rough going. There were these great leads. One of them, which Peary called the River Styx, was a mile wide, and that forced him to detour around it, so that made it very difficult.
That's Pierre Burton, a famous Canadian.
Even their Inuit companions were uneasy. They rarely traveled so far from the safety of land. At one point, a powerful storm blew in, trapping the men in their igloos for 6 long days. Despite these setbacks, Peary reached within 180 miles of the pole, closer than any man before him. But it was late April, and the ice was breaking up around them. Peary and his men were forced to turn back. With the coming of summer, a defeated Peary reluctantly sailed for home.
I have failed once more. I shall never have the chance to win again.
From his home in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Frederick Cook had been following Peary's exploits with veiled interest.
There are a lot of indications that Dr. Cook was interested very early in an attempt on the North Pole. But Dr. Cook was a very sagacious man, and he understood that he just couldn't go out and get the financing and the backing for an attempt on the North Pole without some prior accomplishments to give him credibility.
To establish himself as a serious contender, Cook set out.
So, what I'm going to show you guys in these movies, in this series of documentaries, in this body, is that that what you'll see is that all the explorers on record, all the greats that have been there, that when they get there, something strange happens. None of them have their reports and will provide their reports of the days that they are actually at the pole. So you'll see that this adds into, and you'll see many hints of this as we watch these movies. So I'll point these out as we go along. Peary is one in particular that's very interesting, and the whole dynamic of between him and Cook, what happens and what the society later does. You'll see how this is their official story. So we'll see how this pans out.
Out from Mount McKinley, Alaska in 1906. His goal, to be the first man to scale the tallest peak in North America. That September, he headed for an eastern ridge with a packer named Edward Burrill. 12 days later, the two men returned, announcing that they had reached the summit.
This
The
part
National
later becomes
Geographic
very
Society
important.
celebrated both Cook and Peary's accomplishments at their annual banquet in Washington, D.C. on December 15th, 1906.
They were apparently still speaking at that time. They still appeared to be on friendly terms. Now, whether Peary liked the accolade which was given Cook at that dinner by Alexander Graham Bell, no one will ever know.
In Dr. Cook, we have one of the few Americans who has explored both extremes of the world. And now he has been to the top of the world.
Perhaps these words provoked Peary's simmering jealousies. When he rose to speak, the commander announced that he hadn't yet abandoned his life's ambition.
To me, the final and complete solution of the polar mystery is the thing which should be done for the honor and credit of this country, the thing which it is intended that I should do, and the thing that I must do.
Was Cook sitting there in Peary's shadow, already planning his own attempt to win the pole for himself? July 9th, 1908, New York City. A crowd gathered along the shores of the East River as the ice ship Roosevelt pulled out of its berth. Robert E. Peary, America's most famous polar explorer, was leaving for one final attempt to reach the North Pole. Even President Roosevelt joined in the excitement. Peary stopped at the president's home on Oyster Bay.
Roosevelt came and inspected the whole ship. He admired Peary for heading off into the wilderness. He admired the grit, the determination. When he left, he turned to Peary. He said, "I believe in you, Peary, and I believe in your success if it is within the possibility of man."
Peary's success seemed a foregone conclusion, yet there was an undertone of desperation beneath the fanfare.
I think the North Pole is one of the top secrets that these people have. So it's even plausible. Well, you know, what you just saw there with the president. He may have known, he may not know what was actually up there. He may well have known, and you could see the seriousness in his eye there as he was looking at him.
Simply, he claimed, to go on a hunting trip with a wealthy sportsman, John R. Bradley.
This is interesting.
A few months later, Bradley returned to the States alone. Cook had stayed behind, setting his sights on a surprising goal.
He wrote to the Explorers Club officially announcing his attempt at the pole. He said, "I find I have a good opportunity to go, so I've stayed." And he said, "So here's to the pole with the flag."
Cook knew of Peary's plans to try for the pole in 1908. Did the doctor purposely head north a year earlier to try to beat Peary at his own game? August 1908. The Roosevelt arrived at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. On board were 89 men, including 69 Inuits, and 246 howling dogs. By the end of February 1909, Peary once again prepared to set out across the drifting pack ice. They were 420 miles from the North Pole. Peary had created an innovative relay sledging system. A pioneer team led by Captain Bob Bartlett headed out first, breaking a trail through the jumble of pressure ridges that stacked up like an accordion against the shore. 2 hours later, another team followed, storing vital supplies along the way. Peary and his longtime assistant Matthew Henson were the last to break camp. They began moving easily along Bartlett's trail. 5 days later, a wide stretch of open water, Peary called the Big Lead, halted their progress. Precious days passed as they waited for it to freeze over. After 6 long days,
So this part's
Temperature
interesting in
dropped
that
to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
as he's gotten
and a
up to the
rubbery
North
layer
Pole,
of
as he's
ice
gotten
formed
close,
over the lead.
they've made several different traverses over open water and land. And now at this point, they come again to the big lead, as he calls it. So you'll remember that as we look back to the maps and the descriptions of the size and the the very accurate descriptions of what the North Pole is really like, with a large mountain ring around it, and that outside of the mountain ring that there's the big lead, as he was just saying, that there's a somewhat of a moat, a huge area that as you're coming to it, that's where the in-sucking rivers are taken from. And then as you get to that mountain range, that inside of that again, there's another large waterway. We're going to continue to piece this together as we go through.
As they waited for it to freeze over. After 6 long days, the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a rubbery layer of ice formed over the lead. The sledging teams finally continued northward, averaging 12 miles a day. One at a time, as they completed their jobs, the support parties began to turn back. On March 31st, Peary reached a record farthest north, 133 miles short of the pole. From here, Peary, his aide Matthew Henson, and 4 Inuit would make the final dash.
They rested a day, and then they took off and went as far and as hard as they could.
Conditions on the drifting ice were unusually stable. The sledge meter measured record-breaking speeds.
They didn't let anybody else go with them. Just the 2 men and 4 Inuit went. So as few eyes as possible would see whatever it is that they were going to see.
Their purposes.
5 days later, Peary stopped to take a series of sightings. His calculations told him that he was roughly 3 nautical miles shy of 90 degrees latitude north. The North Pole was within reach, somewhere in the blur of white surrounding him. Yet with scarcely a word to Henson or the Inuits, Peary stumbled into his igloo and went to sleep.
It seems like he would have been jumping up and down for joy. But he said nothing about it, and he kept his counsel for quite a long time.
When he woke 4 hours later, Peary took a series of short sledge journeys up to 10 miles beyond his camp. Even allowing for slight navigational errors, this ensured that he had...
How does this work out? We'll see this again. So here he is with the astrolabe again, showing us a little nod to those who were in the know about the Inventio Fortunatae and measuring the lodestone with the astrolabe. So he stops, takes a series of sightings. It takes 5 days to go across this 130 miles of flat ice. So we know that really there's a mountain range there, and the 4 in-sucking seas, the 4 in-sucking rivers. We know that that's what was really there. And then he's measuring with the astrolabe, and then
His calculations told him that he was
so he's measuring Mount Meru with his astrolabe. But we see a blurry picture of him
the North Pole
with a flag
within
on a
reach,
flat plain.
somewhere in the blur of white surrounding him. Yet with scarcely
Somewhere.
Henson or the Inuits, Peary
No, remember, he cut everybody else off from going with him. And he went and looked with his astrolabe and took measurements, exact precise measurements. But then we cut to
somewhere in the blur of white surrounding him. Yet with scarcely a word to Henson or the Inuits, Peary stumbled into his igloo and went to sleep.
It seems like he would have been jumping up and down for joy. But
it's obviously,
he said nothing about it, and he kept his counsel
not
for
what
quite
happened.
a long time.
So what really happened is that he was at the pole with his astrolabe measuring for the society and taking precise measurements to report back.
When he woke 4 hours later, Peary took a series of short sledge journeys up to 10 miles beyond his camp. Even allowing for slight navigational errors, this ensured that he had crossed over the pole. The date was April 6th, 1909. Robert E. Peary had worked toward this moment all his life. Yet, his emotions were oddly restrained.
At this place, which my observations indicate to be the north polar axis of the Earth, I leave this record and the flag in possession, Robert E. Peary.
When the men arrived back at the Roosevelt, they were so tired they could hardly smile. Peary's strange behavior continued as he secluded himself in his cabin aboard ship for the return voyage.
Himself. Doesn't talk about it.
4 months passed before the Roosevelt arrived at a settlement with a telegraph station. Peary announced his victory to the world, saying, "Stars and stripes nailed to the North Pole." In reply, he received chilling news. 5 days earlier, Dr. Frederick Cook had emerged from the Arctic, claiming he had reached the pole first.
Peary was flabbergasted and bitterly angry, and he probably never got over that particular shock.
Peary had lost. The world was indeed celebrating a polar hero, but it was Cook's story that they eagerly followed as it unfolded on the pages of the New York Herald.
Isn't that strange?
March 18th, 1908. Robert E. Peary was still in New York, outfitting his ship, when Cook had set out from the tip of Axel Heiberg Island. He had the support of only 2 Inuit hunters. 520 miles of ice lay between him and the pole.
Cook's great sledge journey is one of the great journeys in history. It took him 34 days travel by sledge over mountainous pressure ridges, hummocks, open leads of water. Frederick Albert Cook reached the North Pole on April 21st, 1908. He realized the ambition of his life and became thereby the discoverer of the North Pole.
Finally, under skies of crystal blue, we touch the mark. We are at the top of the world. The flag is flung to the frigid breezes of the North Pole.
Cook had reached the pole almost a full year before Commander Peary. But his good fortune didn't hold. The ice began to break up during his return trek, separating the party from vital supply caches. He and his 2 Inuit companions were forced to winter on an island in the high Arctic. The following spring, the 3 men headed out again. They journeyed over 1,000 miles, finally reaching a Danish settlement in Greenland. Cook had been in the Arctic for over 18 months. Now, as he announced his victory to the world, the real competition between Peary and Cook was only just beginning. August 1909, Uummannaq, Greenland. Frederick A. Cook was eager to tell the world of his polar conquest. He boarded the first ship leaving Greenland, which carried him to Denmark. Cook had already wired the New York Herald, announcing that he had reached the North Pole on April 21st, 1908. When the doctor arrived in Copenhagen, he was received as a hero.
Dr. Cook was an overnight sensation. He might call him sort of the Lindbergh of his time. He was given the gold medal of the Danish Geographical Society, and he was literally showered with accolades and acclaim.
At a banquet given in his honor, Cook first received word of Robert Peary's claim to the pole.
He kept a very gentlemanly approach. He said, "There's honor enough for both of us, so why should I object? 2 records are better than 1.
Commander Robert Peary shared no such magnanimous feelings. He never once entertained the notion that Cook had truly reached the pole. Logistically, he reasoned, no man could have gone that far out on the ice without more supplies and men to carry them. While in Nova Scotia, Peary fired off a telegram to the New York Times.
I am the only white man who has ever reached the pole. Do not trouble about Cook's story. He has simply handed the public a gold brick.
Since no flag would still stand in the drifting ice of the pole to settle the issue, Cook offered his personal records to the University of Copenhagen as proof. A newspaper war erupted as accusations flew between the 2 camps. The race for the North Pole became a race for the hearts and minds of the public. Once again, Peary was losing.
Peary fervently believed, absolutely believed, that Cook did not make it and that Cook was lying. But the American people believed initially that Cook had done it and that Peary was nothing except sour grapes, and they reacted very bitterly to Peary's...
So isn't it odd that the story that they've given us about the pole, instead of talking about anything about what's there, now the story has become about the human aspect of it, and we're focused on who got there first, when, how, and why, instead of what is there and what did they observe. They just make it out as though they were in the middle of a gigantic, blurry ice field. In one version of the North Pole, this is the mainstream version, in one version, the North Pole itself is in the middle of an ice field, in the middle of an ocean. There's no land there, and it just freezes up, and you go there and stick your ice in the pole. Or, sorry, stick your flag in the pole. Distractions at us constantly about what the story is with the North Pole.
Claims that Cook was a liar and a cheat.
The first major blow to Cook's credibility came from an unexpected source. Ed Burrill, Cook's packer on the Mount McKinley expedition, told Peary supporters that Cook had fabricated the story of his famous ascent.
Ed Burrill said that no, they hadn't actually climbed Mount McKinley at all, but they had climbed a very insignificant little peak, and that he had taken his by now famous summit photograph on the top of that peak with Ed Burrill standing there holding a flag on an ice axe.
Some people believe that members of the Peary Arctic Club bribed Burrill to change his story. Nonetheless, when asked by reporters to provide his original diary of the climb, Cook refused, saying, "I do not see that it is material."
It really did strike a big blow to Dr. Cook's credibility, and from then on, things just got more and more downhill for him.
The University of Copenhagen fired the final volley. After examining papers Cook had submitted to substantiate his claim, a committee announced that nothing in the material proved he had ever been to the pole.
Unfortunately, by then, Dr. Cook had vanished, and no one could ask him directly.
Cook had taken refuge outside the country to ride out the storm. He soon fell from America's hero to America's disgrace. With each step of Cook's descent, Robert Peary's favor rose accordingly. Peary submitted his records to a 3-man committee of the National Geographic Society. They announced that he had satisfied their standard of proof. Hampton's magazine paid the explorer a record $40,000 to print his story. His place in history seemed secure, although because of his dispute with Dr. Cook, Peary was never satisfied that he had achieved the level of fame he deserved. He died February 20th, 1920, at the age of 63, and was buried with full military honors in Arlington Cemetery. The inscription, "Discoverer of North Pole," marks his grave.
I can't imagine his ever saying that the sacrifice wasn't worth it. He did something because it was there, and he showed grit and determination, creativity, durability. He was your classic American hero, and with the possible exception of Lewis and Clark, he was America's greatest explorer.
Dr. Frederick Cook resurfaced a year after his disappearance, explaining that he had been suffering from mental fatigue. Cook went on to defend himself in print and anywhere else he could tell his story. 2 years before his death in 1940, Cook recorded this last radio interview for posterity.
I have been humiliated and seriously hurt, but that doesn't matter anymore. I'm getting old, and what does matter to me is that I want you to believe that I told the truth. I state emphatically that I, Frederick A. Cook, discovered the North Pole.
Was Peary indeed the first man to achieve that honor? Did the prize belong to Cook? Or should both explorers' claims...
Cook, who's this well-off, hardened, experienced explorer, could have done any type of exploration and done it and proved it and used that as his motivation. Or he could have just gone ahead with his plan that he did anyways for the pole. He didn't need this McKinley trip to prove, they said that he did it to prove his experience in exploration, but he didn't need to do that. And isn't it just odd that he would pull this scam prior to going, only to have it backfire on him later? It's such a perfectly strange situation again. The whole story is very odd. Okay, so again, here what we have is Cook has been there. He's taken his own specific observations. And as you saw in the last little piece there, when they asked for his journal, he wouldn't provide the actual days. And he wouldn't provide the journal. He wouldn't provide the evidence to prove that he had been there. So, again, had he been... Was that something he chose to do? Who knows if he was an independent... I don't think he was an independent explorer at this point. I think that he's already been reached by the Geographic Society, and he wants to please them. You'll see this later, that he's not on the outskirts of that society. So we know how complex these games can become, and wouldn't it be so fitting for them to craft this story that makes for 100 years people are caught up in this story of the race, and they completely lose sight of what was at the poles. And look how easily this was done to distract people away, just with a simple little story and a couple pictures, and people are running on a tangent.
Be questioned. Some modern experts believe that Peary, faced with personal failure, falsified the facts of his final 5-day dash for fame and glory. They point to his sledging speeds over that period as improbable. They point to his moodiness upon his return as the product of a man preparing to perpetuate a fraud. More importantly, they offer hard evidence, 2 telling pages of his polar journal.
There's 2 days that he was allegedly at the North Pole. There isn't anything in his diary about this. There are 2 blank pages. In his diary, there's a loose leaf page, separate, on different paper, on which Peary has put a date on it, written, "The pole at last. I've found it," and so on. Very suspicious.
Peary's supporters including the National Geographic Society, counter that modern photogrammetric tests measuring the angle of the sun in Peary's polar photographs prove he was no liar. Also, Peary took a series of ocean soundings that correspond to modern topographical maps, lending even more credibility to his claim. In this climate of accusation and recrimination, no clear winner emerged from the race to the North Pole. But something was clearly lost in the struggle: America's trust in its heroes. The Peary-Cook rivalry laid bare that dark side of ambition, which had driven promising men to lie, to risk lives, and ultimately to destroy each other, all in the name of glory. Yet other enterprising men were not discouraged from new contests. At the opposite end of the earth, on the frozen crust of a sleeping continent, two men, Norwegian Roald Amundsen and Englishman Robert Scott, prepared for a similar quest. Their target? The last great geographical prize, the South Pole. To reach it, they faced a harrowing journey.
Okay, so we're going to be in Antarctica now. So what I want to point out to you is how the imagery that they use for Antarctica, again, the beginning imagery, which is what your mind clings to as they draw it in and use different techniques to make you remember these things. So what your mind is drawn to through the first imagery is that you see mountains again. So your mind is told again that Antarctica is full of mountains. And you'll remember the thing that Byrd did by going on TV and saying that there's warm areas in Antarctica with some sort of other side. And I think that this is misleading.
Only one of them would make it back alive. Naval service had long been tradition in the Scott family. When Robert Falcon Scott was born on June 6, 1868, his career as a seaman was preordained. By age 30, he had risen to the rank of torpedo lieutenant, but Scott had no money or family connections to ensure further advancement.
Scott felt himself to be intrinsically quite unlucky, that he had to overcome some obstacles which were always being put out in his path. And it was this sense of struggle, I think, which sort of preyed on his mind at times.
Scott's moodiness may have also damaged his chances for promotion. One expert believes his naval records have been censored, concealing negative evaluations of Scott's on-the-job performance.
I'm morally certain that the Navy regarded him as a dud. There is evidence that Scott was regarded as mentally unstable by the Navy, and therefore under normal conditions would never have been allowed anywhere near the command of a ship of the line.
Scott's future seemed bleak until in June of 1899, he heard that the Royal Geographical Society was organizing an Antarctic expedition. He knew its president, Sir Clements Markham, was hoping to put a British naval officer at the helm, and Scott personally applied for the job.
He thought this was an opportunity which had been cast in his way. He really believed tremendously in fate. He had never, prior to this, thought of being an explorer or trying to get to the South Pole. In his own words, he said, "I had no predilection for polar exploration."
Gossips noted that Clements Markham seemed to prefer the company of handsome young men to women. Scott's brooding good looks and deep blue eyes, not to mention his charm, certainly caught Markham's attention. On August 6th.
Okay, so right there what you have is a compromised individual, just by the fact that in that day and age, having that held against him, this is what being compromised is that to the public he could be exposed, and so he'll say and do anything that they will tell him to do. And also you can see his Order of Merit or his high order garb on his his regalia there on his uniform. So you can see that, he expects to be fully compensated for his role in this. So anyways, we can't trust anything that he says at this time, or we can't trust anything that he says at that time, because you can see obviously from what we just heard there that he is compromised. That's, to the military officer at that time, that is compromised.
1901, Robert Falcon Scott sailed from the Isle of Wight in command of the National Antarctic Expedition. The expedition ship Discovery had been built especially for polar travel. Most of the crew on board were Navy men like Scott, with no mountaineering or other suitable training for the ordeal that lay ahead. Their selection reflected the bruised state of the British Empire.
Queen Victoria died in 1901 after a very long, successful reign, and the British were finding themselves embroiled in a very difficult war in South Africa against the Boers. And there was this sense that somehow the British were losing their place in the world, that there was a softness creeping in.
To Clements Markham, Scott and his men represented the epitome of British manhood. Navy men who would battle the Antarctic and prove that the Empire could still win the day. January 3rd, 1902. 5 months after leaving England, Lieutenant Robert Scott and his ship Discovery crossed the Antarctic Circle. Perhaps it was here, dwarfed by these massive icebergs, that Scott began to envision a greater glory for England and for himself, to be the first to plant a flag at the South Pole.
Something of note here is that this is not long after Samuel Rowbotham and others have come up with zetetic astronomy and cosmology and other strong evidences against the global model and against the heliocentric model. So some others have pointed this out in other areas where it seems like anytime there's a strong opposition to the heliocentric model, that there's a strong reaction by the powers that be back against it, as we've noted as of late when it was first pointed out about flat Earth. A lot of the stuff that NASA came out with their new photographs of the moon and new photographs of things in space like the Earth rotating. Silly photographs, but nonetheless they try to combat it. So it's interesting to note that this isn't long after. This is 1902, 1909. So this isn't long after Rowbotham has proved that the Earth is flat. And so now what they're doing is going to plant their flag on what they'll call the southern pole, the South Antarctic Pole. And they'll plant their flag there and put out to the media that they have circumnavigated and mapped the area and that they know for certain. And this isn't true, but this is how they counter the major argument. They just go put it on their controlled media that they've planted the flag and that they know for sure that Antarctica is just a continent.
The southern pole had long played a secondary role to the north. Sealers and whalers visited Antarctica's outer islands to conduct their bloody hunts, while ice and fierce storms protected its inner shores. Man had yet visited only a few coastal areas of the mainland when Scott's Discovery docked on the edge of the Great Ice Barrier, a vast shelf of ice the size of Texas that permanently covers part of the Ross Sea.
The sun shines with extraordinary hard white glitter. There is nothing soft in the landscape at all. It dazzles you, it takes you out of yourself. It produces the wish to measure yourself against all that emptiness, all that delectable snow. It seduces you, and it is completely indifferent.
The men explored glaciers, where ice crackled like gunfire, and snow concealed gaping crevices. Their wonder turned to horror when one crewman slipped on a steep slope and fell to his death into the ocean below. In late April, the sun sank below the horizon for its winter hibernation. For 3 months, the men huddled in their quarters as storms raged outside. When night gave way to the midnight sun, Scott prepared to set out on an exploratory sledge journey inland. He selected 2 men to accompany him. The first was Edward Wilson, an amiable doctor and artist, whom the...
Okay, so again, what we see is that as they begin the actual exploratory journey, that he cuts off 99% of the crew from seeing what he's going to see and figure out what he's going to figure out. And this is the enlightened officer that has the astrolabe and the stellar, the knowledge about the skies to figure out what latitudes they're at, what things are happening, and what's really going on here. But he cuts off 99% of the crew from coming with him and seeing his calculations. And this is the real exploration. This is the part that matters, the part that counts. All the rest of it is just like a whaling ship. They've just arrived at a location. These guys are just sailors. They're doing their jobs. But we see again that as he begins the major polar exploration portion, that he cuts off the crew from seeing what's going on.
Prepared to set out on an exploratory sledge journey inland. He selected 2 men to accompany him. The first was Edward Wilson, an amiable doctor and artist, whom the men had dubbed Uncle Bill.
What was he really doing there? What he's really doing, you can see it clearly, is he's drawing out the sun and the sun dogs. You can see what he's playing with there? What Uncle Bill is playing with?
The second was Ernest Shackleton, an engaging Anglo-Irishman with polar ambitions of his own. On November 2nd, 1902, the 3 men saluted king and country with a champagne toast before the sledges pulled away. Scott's goal was to reach a record farthest south, possibly the South Pole itself. At first, the sledges virtually flew forward, but it wasn't long before the dogs became ill. The men used whips to spur them on. Still, their pace slackened.
And what I've been showing you guys by showing you the old film reel is that imagine you're aristocracy and you know that the earth is flat and you've been running a deception on humanity, and so you take film, you do things for TV, and when you do them for public consumption and for major consumption, because you've developed film, because your film industry is developing, as things get better, as the technology gets better, and as you figure out more things about the way the flat earth works, you record those things and you use them to teach your own family, the people that are supposedly the enlightened, and you run these film reels for them that show what the sun is really doing, how it really functions. So those ones that I showed you guys with the light sources earlier, with the convex and concave lenses, you can see what they were really doing is filming the way that it worked. They've got the bowl, they've got the light source in the center of it. They were filming for posterity, for themselves. So I'd imagine that it's a possibility that there's 2 sets of every movie, or a lot of the movies that we've seen over the years, that there's 2 versions of, not the movies, but documentaries like these, that there's 2 versions of them, one for public consumption and one for their own internal consumption. And really they talk about, look, this is how things are really operating, and they pass that information to themselves. But out to the public, we get these silly documentaries that we always see, that I remember when I grew up, I would always have, as I watched these documentaries, in the middle of them, like the one about If Earth is Flat, In Search of the Edge. I remember seeing that when I was a little kid, and I remember that movie very clearly now that I'd seen it after Flat Earth. I totally remember thinking at the time, my God, it's flat because the water's flat. He just proved it. But they still found a way in school to get us to get our minds away from that and forget about it. So, just thinking out loud, it's really interesting that I think that if you look at old film reels and old educational stuff, you're going to see a lot of things that are telling you, by reading between the lines, that the images they're showing you, they're going to be showing you the actual workings of the Earth while they're telling you that it works another way. So, just thinking.
Antarctica, the coldest, most savage place on Earth. So remote, its very existence was questioned by navigators for centuries. Even after it was discovered in 1820, it remained for decades terra incognita, a land unknown. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the age of Antarctic exploration had taken hold, and the continent was being visited by a growing number of expeditions. Much research was being done, and there was a growing competition to be the first to reach the heart of the interior. One of the main competitors was Robert Falcon Scott. This was his hut, a place quite literally frozen in time. Scott had set out from England to make history, trying to become the first person to stand on the South Pole. He reached his goal, but when he arrived, he found that a Norwegian team had beaten him to it. Disaster struck on the return journey, and his entire party perished in the brutal cold. Scott's final haunting diary entry shook the outside world.
Had we lived, I should have had a tale of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies.
Again, don't try to go there or you'll die.
For years after his death, Scott was regarded as a hero, a British icon who had shown courage and nobility in the face of insurmountable odds. But as time went by, critics began to question his aptitude, calling him an ill-prepared adventurer whose bad judgment had cost his team their lives. He was portrayed as irrational, consistently inept.
But again, he's the greatest hero, the most capable man, the most competent person, and he's also a bumbling idiot.
A heroic bungler.
I signed on to some extent to the legend of Scott the Bumbler when I first went to the Antarctic. But that legend just doesn't stand up against reality. Not when you get to know these guys, not when you look at the facts of what happened to them.
Doesn't she remind you guys of the NASA lady and a lot of these spokespersons? They're hilarious. They're all the same. They have this thing about them. You can just tell that they're making crap up and lying.
Not when you get to know these guys, not when you look at the facts of what happened to them.
Climatologist Susan Solomon has spent years in Antarctica studying the ozone layer. She became interested in Scott's story after a visit to his hut, questioning the popular theory of his incompetence.
She's going to tell us that Antarctica is getting hotter and that it's all our fault for burning too much gasoline.
Her conclusions were startling.
What a joke.
For rather than confirming his mistakes,
I'm going to do a piece shortly about
evidence of Scott as a
how it's such a fraud.
With a deep faith in science. Ironically, it was this very faith that would lead his team to disaster.
They planned so scientifically. They tried to figure out how they would put what resources they had and what nature would normally be expected to throw at them together and be able to succeed. And they would have succeeded in a normal year.
Tragedy at the pole. Don't go there. You'll die. Don't go near the poles. Don't go there.
In November of 1910, Robert Scott arrived in the Antarctic aboard the ship Terra Nova. He established his base camp in a hut at Cape Evans, and on November 1st, 1911, after a year of preparation, he set off for the pole. 2 weeks later, Scott and his party of 16 men, 10 ponies and 22 dogs arrived at a location 150 miles inland. They called the site One Ton Depot because earlier in the year, members of the expedition had journeyed there to leave over a ton of supplies. 1 ton was to be the springboard for their assault on the pole and a safety valve for their return.
So from here on, I guess I would assume you've had enough of me talking, so I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of the documentary, remembering as you're watching the whole time that none of what they're saying about the Antarctic can be taken as truth. We know that it's a giant ring around us. I'll just give you another shot of that before I part, and I'll let you watch the rest of the documentary in peace. But remember that while you're watching it, try and remember that it's a ring around you. And watch the shots that they give you and listen clearly to what they're saying. And you can piece together more of what's really there. Take anything this NASA chick with the purple muumuu on says. Take anything she says with a grain of salt. Alright, I'm out for now. Obviously, what this is alluding to and showing is that there's a lot more going on at the North Pole and at the South Pole than what they would have us believe. Alright, Flatwater out. I'll talk to you guys soon. Ciao.
Despite all their planning and stockpiling of provisions, the odds were against them making it to the pole. Scott himself had failed in an attempt 8 years earlier, as had Shackleton in 1909. The continent of Antarctica is larger than India and China combined, and from Scott's hut at Cape Evans, the trek to the pole was more than 900 miles. The first part of the journey would take them 400 miles across the featureless Ross ice shelf. Then they would have to climb the 125-mile-long Beardmore Glacier. Finally, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, the team would face the final 370-mile slog to the pole itself. If they made it, they would then have to retrace their steps back to the safety of the hut. Scott's expedition was financed by the Royal Geographical Society, which expected him not only to reach the pole, but also to oversee rigorous scientific research while he was there.
Scott was tremendously interested in science. I mean, not only was he proud of the fact that he was leading the biggest scientific expeditions that had ever gone down south, it was much deeper than that. He derived enormous intellectual satisfaction from the scientific work which was being done by his team. He was hugely curious about it.
Scott was the leader of a well-financed and highly publicized Antarctic expedition. He was equipped with the very best technology available, and he had surrounded himself with the most accomplished scientists he could find. Herbert Ponting, the team's official photographer, made a film documenting the expedition and the scientific work being done.
Outside the hut, Lieutenant Evans would spend hours with his telescope, making astronomical observations. An intensely cold job, which demanded stoical quality.
Among others, the presence of meteorologist George Simpson was featured on the film.
Inside the hut, the meteorologist Dr. Simpson had a vast collection of scientific instruments for studying weather conditions. Surgeon Atkinson did research work with his microscope.
Simpson, nicknamed Sonny Jim, became indispensable to Scott. He was responsible for recording and analyzing the Antarctic weather, and Scott respected him immensely. The feeling was mutual.
Simpson said that he had never met anyone who had the scientific spirit so utterly unalloyed. All of the scientists particularly admired him. They all talked about him as being someone who could get to the nub of any scientific question immediately.
But later critics of Scott claimed he had made irrational decisions. These claims did not sit well with Solomon, who discovered much evidence to the contrary. Wherever she looked, she found signs that Scott had been a meticulous planner. The scientific method seemed to be at the heart of his preparations.
Captain Scott used to spend a lot of his time in his little den writing up his journal and working out plans for the journey to the pole. For every detail had to be carefully thought out beforehand.
Scott devised a careful plan. Knowing that it would be impossible for the men to carry all their supplies with them, he had ordered a series of earlier journeys into the interior to stockpile provisions along the route. For transport across the ice shelf, Scott chose ponies because Shackleton had had success with them 2 years earlier. Dogs and motorized tractors would provide minimal backup support, and the ponies would be slaughtered en route to provide food. Once at the Beardmore Glacier, the men would hold their own supplies. This would be grueling on the outbound trek, but Scott was counting on light loads and a strong tailwind to drive them back to the depots on the return. Each leg of the journey had its own carefully thought-out team. A party of 16 would set out from base camp to help carry provisions. At the glacier, half the men in the 2 dog teams would turn back, while the other 8 men continued on. When they reached the plateau, Scott would select 3 men to accompany him on the final leg. Timing would be crucial. In order to beat the onset of winter, the team had to be back at Cape Evans by the end of March. Scott had thought through every detail. How many units of food the men would need per day, how many miles they would have to average on the polar plateau and on the ice shelf. For Solomon, there was nothing sloppy about Scott's preparation.
I think Scott tried to plan the journey to the pole very much as a scientist and as an engineer, in a sense. He tried to figure out what it would take and how he would do it. That's very much, I think, the modern way. It's, in a sense, he was a man ahead of his time.
As they approached the top of the Beardmore Glacier, the excitement began to grow. They were nearing the end of the second leg, and it was almost time for Scott to pick his final team for the actual assault on the pole. It had been 40 days since they left One Ton Depot, and the going had been difficult. A blizzard had delayed them near the base of the glacier, and the ponies had struggled through the heavy snow. But Scott had pressed them to make up time, and they were now back on track. The team had finished with the ponies and was now relying on man-hauling. Each 800-pound sledge was pulled by a team of 4 men. In addition to his race against winter, Scott had another reason to push the pace. On the way to Antarctica, he had found out that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who had lost his bid to become the first to the North Pole, was now trying to beat Scott to the south.
Scott realized that actually it was going to be a race between the 2 of them and that Amundsen could very well get there before him. But at the same time, he tried to push that out of his mind because he was, I think, just as interested for much of the time about the scientific achievement that he hoped would come from his expedition, the work that his team that he was taking down there was going to do.
Above the Beardmore, Scott was feeling confident. At the last minute, he decided on a polar party of 5, instead of the 4 he had originally intended. Perhaps he wanted to reward as many as possible for the hard work they had done to reach that point. Scott's critics regard this change as a crucial mistake. But Solomon is convinced that while it may have led to discomfort, it was not a big enough gaffe to derail the expedition.
The problem with having 5 men had in part to do with the fact that it took longer to cook for 5 than 4. Scott confessed that. It was a big problem. It took a half an hour more. The tent was really too small for 5 men. Somebody would get kind of pushed off the floor cloth onto the edge of of the tent. That's obviously not a good situation. So for many reasons, having 5 instead of 4 was a mistake, but I don't think it would have been a fatal one.
Finally, on the Antarctic plateau, the men continued to trudge southward. Their spirits were high, but they were beginning to grow tired after nearly 60 days of marching, dragging their sledges behind them. On January 9th, they passed the southernmost point reached by Shackleton in 1909. They were now walking on virgin ground. Scott was still confident.
It is wonderful that 2 long marches would land us at the pole. We left our depot today with 9 days' provisions, so that it ought to be a certain thing now.
Scott had good reason to anticipate success. His team was making excellent progress, and he was impressed with the men he had chosen for the final push. Edmund Wilson, the expedition's chief scientist, was a doctor and a talented artist, and Scott's best friend. Henry Bowers, nicknamed Birdie for his prominent nose, was known for his exceptional stamina. Lawrence Oates, the aristocratic but unassuming army captain, had been in charge of the ponies on the expedition. And Seaman Edgar Evans. He was the strong man of the group. By the middle of January, the men had covered nearly 900 miles. They had climbed 10,000 feet up a glacier strewn with crevasses, and they had survived on rations of dried meat and lard. Now, they were approaching their final destination. On January 17, 1912, the team reached the pole. But the glory that Scott had dreamed of was denied him, for he was met by the sight of a tent flying the Norwegian flag. Amundsen, Scott's great rival, had beaten him to the pole. It was a crushing blow.
The wind is blowing hard. Temperature is -21, and there is that curious, damp, cold feeling in the air which chills one to the bone in no time. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Amundsen's strategy had been very different from Scott's. Relying on his experience from the Arctic, he had foregone careful planning and made a dash for the pole. He had taken a gamble and won, beating Scott by a full 5 weeks.
Amundsen got to the pole first because of his transport arrangements. Very simple, a few men on skis with lots of dogs. He was able to take less time getting to the pole and back again, and he was able to eat the dogs as they travelled. He knew about travelling over snow and ice. He knew about the cold.
They had not been first, but Scott's men planted the British flag and then began the long journey home. Scott's preparations had served them well, and they believed they would quickly make it back to the safety of the coast, even though Edgar Evans was beginning to have problems with frostbite. Scott's confidence came from his careful planning and from his understanding of the weather data that meteorologist Simpson had provided him. In fact, Solomon found that Scott was counting on the weather to bring them home.
I had to really step back in time, because a critical part of putting the pieces of the puzzle together was actually getting a sense of the science that they did, their approach to understanding the weather, to have a sense of whether or not they just blindly sauntered out into Antarctica not knowing what would happen, or whether they actually tried to figure out what they ought to expect.
Solomon was surprised to discover just how attentive Scott had been to the weather, and just how determined Simpson had been to understand it. Long before the advent of modern forecasting equipment, they had attempted something that had never been done in Antarctica. They had based their schedule on a prediction of the weather.
Simpson very carefully tried to understand what the weather should be like, To figure out how you'd get to the pole and get back, the weather was going to be a key component of that process. And Scott's writings make it clear that he was worried about that he and Simpson talked about it. He wrote in his diaries many times, the temperature is -17, inform Simpson. Remember to talk about this with Simpson.
In Simpson, Scott had found a man who matched his own passion for science. Simpson had been born into a family of umbrella makers in Derby, England. His father established a department store bearing the family name, and Simpson was expected to follow in his father's footsteps. But the boy showed an uncanny ability in science, and instead became the first member of his family to go to university. His advisor there was a personal friend of Scott's, and he recommended Simpson for the polar expedition.
He was an amazing guy. The insights that Simpson had into many different aspects of Antarctic meteorology are just incredible. He was the first to figure out why the Antarctic summer is colder than the Arctic summer. He was the first to really launch balloons in the Antarctic and study how the temperatures changed as a function of altitude, which was a really stunning achievement. He was clearly a scientist of tremendous capability.
As Solomon pored over the data in Simpson's papers, she realized she was looking at something truly remarkable. In front of her, on the yellowing pages of century-old diaries, were the first ever forecasts of the Antarctic interior, composed from Simpson's observations in the year prior to the push for the pole. Solomon examined every detail of the forecasts.
I wasn't prepared for what I found looking at Simpson's books and other documents. It's incredible to me that he was able to piece together enough information about the weather to make a remarkably accurate forecast for what the conditions ought to have been like for the journey to the pole and the entire journey back. The way he did that was just amazing.
Simpson predicted that the temperature at the Cape Evans base camp would be warmer than the Antarctic interior, not simply because of the natural warming effect of the ocean, but also because the nearby mountains blocked the cold winds coming off the ice shelf. He built a weather station just above the hut, where readings of temperature, wind speed, and wind direction were taken on an hourly basis. To get data from the interior, he trained the men to take temperature readings 3 times a day on every one of their depot supply journeys. By comparing the records from the depot trips with the corresponding measurements from Cape Evans, Simpson came to the conclusion that throughout the year, the ice shelf was consistently 20 degrees colder than Cape Evans. From his findings, he was able to forecast the temperature on the ice shelf for every month of the polar journey. Simpson's approach was years ahead of its time, but it remained to be seen how accurate his predictions really were. Over the last 20 years, technology has allowed modern scientists to learn a great deal about Antarctica's weather patterns. One of the most powerful tools in this quest to unravel the continent's secrets is a network of automated weather stations that gather temperature, wind, and other meteorological data every day of the year, sending it via satellite to labs around the world. Examining this archive, Solomon was quickly able to work out typical temperatures for every month of Scott's journey. When she compared her modern results to Simpson's 1911 predictions, she was amazed to discover that Simpson's forecasts were never more than 3 degrees off.
How cold would it be at the pole in January? He figured that out. How cold would it be on the ice shelf? How cold would it be on the last part of the journey? He had all of that nailed to a T.
When Scott left the pole, he was relying on Simpson's forecast for the return journey. He had planned his schedule around the temperatures he knew he could expect, and so far, everything had gone according to plan. The team made its way back across the high plateau, and as Simpson had predicted, temperatures hovered near a frigid negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The party was averaging more than 15 miles a day. But Edgar Evans was suffering from worsening frostbite, and his situation was getting serious. Evans was beginning to lose heart.
Evans is the chief anxiety now. His cuts and wounds suppurate. His nose looks very bad. And altogether he shows considerable signs of being played out. Things may mend for him on the glacier, and his wounds get some respite under warmer conditions.
The men's spirits rose when they arrived back at the Beardmore. But on the way down, Evans sustained a severe head injury when he and Scott fell into a crevasse. Scott had hoped the warmer temperatures on the ice shelf would help Evans recover. But after the accident, his situation began to look hopeless. His comrades encouraged him to push on, but 2 weeks later, Evans collapsed.
I was first to reach the poor man, and shocked at his appearance. He was on his knees with clothing disarranged and a wild look in his eyes. We got him on his feet, but after 2 or 3 steps, he sank down again. He showed every sign of complete collapse. Wilson, Bowers, and I went back to the sledge, while Oates remained with him. When we returned, he was practically unconscious, and we got him into the tent quite comatose. He died quietly at 12:30 a.m.
Frostbite had taken its toll, but Wilson, the team doctor, documented the cause of death as brain damage. Evans had been done in by a freak accident, something no amount of planning could have prevented. There was nothing the team could do but bury him and move on. With Evans gone, the men quickened their pace. The day after they buried their friend, Scott, Wilson, Oates, and Bowers approached their resupply depot near the base of the glacier. They were finally back on the ice shelf. Here, stockpiles of food and fuel awaited them. At last, the frigid temperatures of the plateau were supposed to be behind them. Simpson's forecast called for strong tailwinds and much more moderate temperatures. They were still 400 miles away from Cape Evans, but they expected the worst was behind them.
The very first night that they regained the barrier, Scott talked about how they've had a good night's sleep for a change because it was so nice and warm. They weren't even worried when they got back down to the Ross Ice Shelf. At that point, they thought they had it made.
For the next 6 days, everything went according to plan. But on February 27th, the temperature suddenly dropped to a brutal 37 degrees below zero. This was far worse than anything they had experienced on the plateau. For the first time, a hint of uncertainty entered Scott's writing.
Desperately cold last night. Pray God we have no further setbacks. We may find ourselves in safety at next depot, but there is now a horrid element of doubt.
The doubts did not let up. Brief periods of such bitter cold were manageable, but for days, the thermometer refused to budge, only once rising above -30. The men were stunned by the unexpected weather. Wilson and Bowers had survived worse temperatures on an earlier research expedition, but never for this long, and never after 4 months of exhausting manholing.
It's not just the fact that it was cold for 3.5 straight weeks. You probably can't appreciate what the impact of that is on the human body unless you've actually been through it. Those kind of temperatures are absolutely killing.
Scott's carefully laid plans were in tatters, and the lives of his men hung in the balance. The staggering cold had thrown his schedule into disarray, and everyone was nearing exhaustion. The sledges became harder and harder for the straining men to pull.
The surface, lately a very good, hard one, is coated with a thin layer of woolly crystals. These are too firmly fixed to be removed by the wind and cause impossible friction on the runners. God help us, we can't keep up this pulling. That is certain.
Normally, friction from the sledge melts a thin layer of snow that lubricates the runners as they slide. But below -20, the snow remains crystalline and grips the runners tightly. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, a polar explorer who pulled a sledge across Antarctica in 1993, knows all too well what Scott and his men had struggled with.
We developed a real feeling for the problems that Scott faced from day to day with the variety of snow surfaces and temperatures. If you want to practice it, you want to get 2 6-foot fat men, put them into a bathtub with no legs, and pull them, for in his case 1,600 miles, over sand dunes. That's the friction that you actually get. There's no sliding.
But even as the conditions got worse, Scott made no effort to lighten the load. It is a decision his critics have often cited as a clear indication of his incompetence. 3 weeks earlier, the party had spent a day collecting 30 pounds of rock samples on the plateau. So when the going got rough, why didn't Scott dump the extra weight? Fiennes says lightening the load would have made little difference.
Pulling sledges is a very unpredictable thing. You can halve the load of a sledge and have bad snow and go slower than the full load of the sledge with good snow. So the great thing about putting a few rocks, 30 pounds of rocks on their sledges, wouldn't have made much difference.
They weren't stupid. They weren't going to keep them on the sledge if it was really killing them. They could have just depoted them and come back for them the following year. What was killing them wasn't the weight of the rocks, it was the friction of the snow.
The unyielding surface had a devastating effect on their progress. Instead of averaging 15 miles a day, they could barely manage 3.5. At this rate, they would never make it back to Cape Evans in time to beat the onset of winter, when temperatures would drop to an unsurvivable 50 below. To make matters worse, the tailwind that Scott had been expecting, another crucial element of Simpson's forecast, was also failing to materialize.
Hope for better things this afternoon, but no improvement apparent. Oh, for a little wind.
On the previous journeys back from the depots, the teams had erected sails on the sledges when the wind began to blow from the south. Scott had calculated this added advantage into his plans, so without it, his team was in even more trouble. The wind had aided them before, but this time, the air stayed bitter and still.
The surface remains awful, the cold intense, and our physical condition running down. God help us, not a breath of favorable wind for more than a week.
The elements were unyielding. They were trapped in a condition we now call a temperature inversion. The reflective surface of the ice loses energy rapidly, creating a layer of cold air sandwiched between the ground and a warmer layer above. Only wind can bring the warm air back down to ground level. But for Scott, the wind refused to arrive.
When it's windy, it's actually warm in the Antarctic. I know that sounds terribly counterintuitive, but many of the warmest days you'll have down there in Antarctic winter have just enough wind to keep things stirred up.
Frigid temperatures and no wind had left the team with little hope. They were now relying on sheer force of will to get them home. But the situation was still getting worse. As they weakened, they became more vulnerable to frostbite, a polar explorer's greatest fear. Captain Oates was the first to succumb.
Poor Oates got it again in the foot. It is only with the greatest pains the rest of us keep off frostbite. No idea there could be temperatures like this at this time of year.
We know now that when we tend to go from -20 -20 Fahrenheit and we crossed to about -30 Fahrenheit, there is quite of a sharp increase in the chance of development of frostbite. In fact, the chance go from about 50% to about 95% within that range.
Frostbite on their feet was the greatest danger, for if they couldn't march, they would die where they fell. The simple ability to keep their socks dry became a matter of life and death.
Very cold nights now, and cold feet starting March, as day footgear doesn't dry at all.
Wet material loses heat 25 times faster than dry, and the cold tents never gave their clothes an opportunity to shed moisture. In fact, the tents were so cold that the men's socks froze solid at night, causing another grave problem every morning. Before beginning the day's march, they had to spend an hour and a half struggling to get their damaged feet into their footwear. It was an agonizing ritual that cost them valuable walking time and left their feet ever more susceptible to the chill.
Their feet would have been raw in many places, so you don't want to press raw flesh against a rock-hard sleeping bag. It's one of the most painful things on earth. I remember for about 70 days every morning trying to put my feet, which were gangrenous, with bare-ended toes with no flesh on them, firstly into socks. I mean, it was painful even putting the sock on, and then trying to put them into our ski boots, which were rock-hard. Howard Scott's men not only had that problem every morning, but the problem which we didn't have, which was to not be able to get into their sleeping bags when they were still retaining body warmth from the movement of the day, is unthinkable. I mean, they were very, very brave men, all 5 of them.
But brave as they were, Oates's condition was deteriorating rapidly. This was his second bout with frostbite, and skin that has been damaged once is far more vulnerable to re-injury. His odds of survival were plummeting.
Oates is wonderfully plucky, as his feet must be giving him great pain. He makes no complaint, but his spirits only come up in spurts now, and he grows more silent in the tent. If we were all fit, I should have hopes of getting through. But the poor soldier has become a terrible hindrance, though he does his utmost, and suffers much, I fear.
The team's options were running out. On March 10th, Oates asked Wilson whether he had any chance of pulling through. The doctor said he didn't know.
In point of fact, he has none. Apart from him, if he went under now, I doubt whether we could get through. The weather conditions are awful, and our gear gets steadily more icy and difficult to manage.
The party had endured 13 days of temperatures below -30. In such conditions, water freezes in under a minute. Fingers bond instantly to metal. Humans exist here at the very margins of survival.
Oates is very near the end, one feels. He is a brave fellow and understands the situation, but he practically asked for advice. Nothing could be said but to urge him to march as long as he could.
A few days later, Oates requested that Scott leave him in his sleeping bag. He said he could go no further and knew he was holding the rest of them back. His companions begged him to rally, and he relented, but the cold was quickly overcoming him. 3 days later, with the temperature now -43 degrees Fahrenheit, Oates took matters into his own hands.
Oates slept through the night, hoping not to wake. But he woke in the morning. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." He went out into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew it was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. We all hope to meet the end with a similar spirit, and assuredly the end is not far.
Their group was down to 3, but only 160 miles separated them from the safety, warmth, and food at Cape Evans. If the cold broke and they could increase their daily mileage, they might still have a chance. 11 miles a day would mean only 2 more weeks on the ice. But the day after Oates' death, Scott found himself in trouble. During a bout of violent indigestion, he failed to notice when his right foot began to freeze. Within minutes, his toes were severely frostbitten.
There is no chance to nurse one's feet. Amputation is the least I can hope for now. But will the trouble spread?
Scott made only a few more diary entries after that. On March 21st, he wrote that the party was now only 11 miles from the depot at One Ton Camp. But a blizzard had stopped them in their tracks, and they were nearly out of fuel. Their only hope was for Wilson and Bowers to depart for the depot alone.
Wilson and Bowers unable to start. Must be near the end. Have decided it shall be natural. We shall march for the depot with or without our effects and die in our tracks.
But they never marched again. In his last diary entry, dated March 29th, Scott wrote that the blizzard had raged for 10 days, keeping them trapped in the tent.
I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people.
Bowers composed a last letter to his mother.
As this may possibly be my last letter to you, I am sorry it is such a short scribble. We have had a terrible journey back. When man's extremity is reached, God's help may put things right. It is splendid to pass, however, with such companions as I have. I should so like to come through for your dear sake. Much and dearest love to your dear self, and May, and Edie.
Wilson wrote to his wife, Oriana.
My love is as living for you as ever. We will all meet after death, and death has no terrors. Don't be unhappy, darling. All is for the best. We are playing a good part in a great scheme arranged by God himself, and all is well.
Scott wrote a letter he titled, Message to the Public. In it, he listed the reasons the expedition had failed. He stressed that the logistics, the food supplies, clothing, and depots, had worked out to perfection. Then, he described the weather they'd faced on the ice shelf.
No one in the world would have expected the temperatures and surfaces which we encountered at this time of year. Our wreck is certainly due to this sudden advent of severe weather, which does not seem to have satisfactory cause. I do not think human beings ever came through such a month as we have come through.
Scott blamed the weather, but he was careful in his choice of words. Susan Solomon believes Scott's final note also contained a redemptive message to his meteorologist and friend, George Simpson.
I think I know why he said no one. Because he wanted Simpson to understand that he was not blaming him for the fact that the forecast didn't turn out to be right. He was saying, look, Sonny Jim, you couldn't have forecast this. No one in the world could have forecast this. And we're dying, but it's not your fault.
Prior to his departure, Scott had briefed the support teams that the Polar Party would return to Cape Evans by late March. As the days turned into weeks, the 13 men back in the hut grew increasingly worried. But there was little they could do as winter set in. April became May, and the sun sank lower and lower on the horizon, enveloping the continent in another long, cold, Antarctic winter. It was another 6 months before a recovery team could set out across the ice shelf. After 2 weeks of searching, one of the men saw the tip of Scott's tent sticking out of the winter snow. The search party recovered the men's diaries and letters. Scott's favorite hymn was sung, and the commanding officer read some of their last words aloud. Then they removed the tent poles and allowed the canvas to shroud their lifeless comrades' bodies. They built a large snow cairn and erected a cross, then headed back to Cape Evans. It took a year for the news of Scott's death to reach George Simpson. Simpson had seen Scott off from Cape Evans, but soon after had been recalled from Antarctica and sent to work at the British Meteorological Office in India. He found Scott's death extremely difficult to deal with.
The news of the sad disaster came to India in such dribbles that it was nearly a fortnight before I could really understand what happened. I could not have imagined that the sad news would have affected me so much.
Simpson began reviewing all his records and forecasts, trying to see for himself what had gone wrong. Was it a mistake he had made, or had Antarctica dealt them an unwinnable hand?
At some level, I'm sure he blamed himself. I'm sure that he asked himself, well, you know, could I have done it better? What did I miss? How did I screw up? And he had to be asking himself those questions, and therefore he was driven, I'm sure, by a sense of tremendous sadness over the fact that these men had died and that he had, in some way, played a role.
6 years later, Simpson published the first of a painstaking 3-volume study on the meteorology of Antarctica. In it, he concluded that the temperatures recorded by Scott's party on the ice shelf in March 1912 were nearly 40 degrees colder than those at Cape Evans. It was a difference he knew was not typical. 1912, he theorized, must have been an abnormal year, but he didn't have the data to prove it.
Simpson absolutely nailed it. He not only figured out what the weather should have been like for the Polar Party, but he also looked at what they actually experienced and understood how unusual it was. He figured out that they would have made it back in about 9 out of 10 years. Turns out he was a little conservative. It's more like 15 out of 16. I mean, I don't think you have to be a scientist to be stunned by that, to be in awe of that man's insights.
Nearly 90 years after Simpson's forecast, Solomon was able to prove that his work had been perfect. But she had the benefit of the modern weather stations with their constant measurements, while Simpson could only rely on his more crude readings. His forecasts were stunningly accurate, but in the end, they made no difference. 1912 was such an aberration, there is no way Simpson could have predicted it.
To see that this man correctly predicted what it would take for those men to survive, what they ought to have had in terms of very survivable weather on the way back, and that he died not knowing that he was right, was an incredibly moving and really quite important experience for me. It almost drove me to tears.
Simpson's work was ahead of its time, and no one picked up on his conclusions about the disaster. He moved to London soon after he published his findings, which were so dense and technical, few could understand them. He soon buried himself in other work.
He lived in his study, had a big study in that biggish house that we lived in there. And he simply stayed in there all the time and didn't come out except to eat a meal, that sort of thing. And I used to go in as a child to kiss him goodnight on my way to bed, but then he didn't even always look up and notice. And I remember coming out saying, "Daddy doesn't love me," because I simply hadn't been able to get any response out of him at all.
Simpson presented his views about the role of the weather in Scott's death only once, in a scientific lecture he gave in 1923. Then, he never spoke publicly about it again.
Simpson was a very meticulous and careful scientist, and I think he would have been reluctant to talk about the weather as an issue very much because he couldn't prove that it was unusual. I couldn't have proved it either until all that nice weather station data was accumulated. So it had to be somewhat by extrapolation that he made his argument, and I think as a good scientist he probably would be uncomfortable with that.
Solomon's work had established Simpson's legacy as a scientist, and had also shattered many of the myths about Scott's ineptitude. But she was still troubled by one aspect of the story.
The thing that kept bothering me at the end was the way they died. Scott and his men made camp on March 19th for the last time. They never left it. March 29th is the date of Scott's last diary entry. It's been thought that a blizzard is what kept them in the tent for 10 full days. But if you've been to that part of the Antarctic, you know that blizzards just don't last more than 2 or 3 days. And if they had a 10-day blizzard, my God, they had the blizzard of a century. And then suddenly I realized that it actually couldn't have happened. Scott's own men provide the observations that show that there was no blizzard. 2 men, Atkinson and Kahane, went out onto the Ross Ice Shelf to look for Scott and Bowers and Wilson. They didn't go very far, but they were experiencing light winds, temperatures of 0 to -17, perfect weather for keeping on going. This was on March 27th. So on March 27th, or maybe even before, the wind had already stopped. That made clear that the reason that the 3 of them stayed in the tent was not a meteorological reason. It had to be a human reason. And that, I realized, was probably the fact that Scott's foot was very badly frostbitten. Wilson, who was a doctor, wrote to his parents that Scott could scarcely walk. He didn't say anything about a blizzard in that letter to his parents. He said that he loved them, that he would see them in heaven, and that the captain just couldn't go on. And so I believe that Wilson and Bowers decided that they simply couldn't accept going on without him, and they perhaps misled him into thinking that the blizzard was still raging. Bowers had tremendous loyalty to Scott. He wrote to his mother that I am Captain Scott's man and will stick by him right through. Wilson, who was a doctor, had talked about if he were ever with a sick companion, he would not be able to abandon that companion, no matter what. Wilson and Bowers are probably the truest heroes of this whole story, if what I'm saying is correct. Because not only did they probably sacrifice themselves, but they did it in silence. They didn't actually write or say what they were doing. I think they were too loyal to do that.
Scott would not have known what his comrades had done for him. But in his final hours, he revealed how highly he thought of them. He wrote letters to their families, making sure they would know how decent each had been. To Bowers' mother.
I write when we are very near the end of our journey, and I am finishing it in company with 2 gallant, noble gentlemen. One of these is your son. As the troubles have thickened, his dauntless spirit ever shone brighter, and he has remained cheerful, hopeful, and indomitable to the end. My whole heart goes out in pity for you.
To Wilson's wife.
If this letter reaches you, Bill and I will have gone out together. We are very near it now, and I should like you to know how splendid he was at the end. Everlastingly cheerful and ready to sacrifice himself for others. I can do no more to comfort you than to tell you that he died as he lived. A brave, true man, the best of comrades, and staunchest of friends.
We can never turn back the clock, but I think it's highly likely that if Scott had survived, his legacy would be viewed quite differently. He still certainly wouldn't have been the guy who got to the pole first, but he would have been the leader of a great scientific expedition, an expedition that even today is viewed as a cornerstone of Antarctic science. He was a man of incredible ability. He was a man who could inspire a lot of loyalty. Then I think we just have to admire what he did achieve and what all of them achieved.